Hello, I'm Violet Manners, and welcome to Hidden Heritage, the podcast that brings you inside Great Britain's favourite destinations, with help from custodians, historians, artisans, and experts. Today on Hidden Heritage, I'm joined by author, historian, and influencer Alice Loxton. With over 1.5 million followers on social media, History Alice, as she's known on Instagram and TikTok, creates bite-sized pieces of historical content for her followers. She's also recently become a published author with her debut non-fiction history book, Uproar, a book which reimagines the history of Georgian Britain through the eyes of artists who immortalised it. It was released in 2023 and has been longlisted for Blackwell's Book of the Year. In today's episode, we're going to explore where Alice's love and passion for heritage originated from. Alice and I discuss her work on social media and how history and heritage continue to find an enormous audience online. I ask Alice about her new book, the inspiration behind it, and why she chose the Georgian setting for it. We also discuss the future, and Alice recommends 3 of her favourite destinations in the UK. But before that, let's get to know Alice in her own words. Alice, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast Hidden Heritage. Can you please just introduce yourself to our listeners?
Of course. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's very exciting to be here. So I'm a historian. I'm also an author and a broadcaster in many senses of the word. Lots of people probably know me from doing these little snippets, looking around historic buildings and putting those on social media. But yeah, I mean, I write for the newspapers, write books, and hopefully will write many books. But it's all about history and it's all about heritage, which are things that I love.
Where did your love for history and heritage originate from? Where did it come from?
It's a boring answer that I've always loved it. I've always loved heritage. I've always loved exploring historic buildings. But I think perhaps that is because in the UK, we are blessed in that we have so many amazing buildings in every street. So I sometimes think about the fact that in every village, even, there is a church pretty much in every village. And if you take one church, I know I could go in and I can make an amazing TikTok that has got some fascinating hidden gem, because these buildings are 800 years old. They're free to go in. Anyone can go and explore them. And that is quite incredible when you think about it. And then, of course, we've got historic houses and cathedrals and all sorts of buildings everywhere. So I think surrounded by this density of heritage was always very inspiring for me.
Yeah. And and so presumably did you grow up with your parents sort of going to visit these places?
Yeah, that was a big part of my childhood, was looking around historic buildings.
Really?
But I've always been fascinated by it. I used to read horrible histories. I used to watch all the Philippa Gregory films and read the books. In all sorts of different guises, I was very interested in history.
Yeah. What did you study at uni?
So I went to Edinburgh Uni and I studied history, and that was amazing. Edinburgh being one of the most historic places ever, surrounded by, those old medieval streets and those beautiful Georgian streets. So again, just being surrounded by this beauty and this history was just really wonderful for me.
Mm-hmm. And then when did History with Alice actually start?
So I used to work for a company called History Hit, which was started by Dan Snow. It's a TV production company and they do lots of podcasts and documentaries. So I worked there after uni. And then when I was there, it was a moment when TikTok and Instagram were really blossoming in terms of people creating all sorts of content, really. But I realized the power that these had, and that you could reach so many people in these short snippets, which are much more kind of manageable than making documentaries. So anyway, I found it a really wonderful platform, a really wonderful way to communicate to people about history, and the rest is history.
Yeah. And also you've really gone on to become, you educate so many people. I mean, you've got 1.5 million people that follow you, and you're educating them. So your account, History Alice, is predominantly across Instagram and TikTok. I'm right in saying, I think. And how in general do you find young people young people respond to the content that you make?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, these platforms get a lot of bad press in some ways, and for good reason in some ways, but it's also this amazing platform for engaging lots of young people. And all I put out on social media is actually pretty similar to what you read in a gallery, to what you see in a museum, to what you read in a book. It's not like there's this crazy spin on it, but I'm just creating the content that is formatted for Instagram and TikTok.
Yeah.
When you do put history on there, it's wonderful to see that lots of people do respond to it. And it's great to see that it's not just me. There's lots of young people making history content, and they make it in all sorts of different ways. It might be that they are tour guides, or it might be that they are making historic dresses or reacting to Bridgerton or whatever it is. So I think it's a wonderfully freeing place to be on these platforms, because anyone can make content about anything. It gives you space to have the weird and the wacky and the very niche things, having a platform and sometimes a massive following.
Yeah, which you now have. On that note, this podcast, Really Hidden Heritage, is also about taking people and inspiring people to go and find some of the UK's finest and favourite destinations. So we're going to move on to, we're kind of like a desert island disc, but for destinations in the UK.
Love it.
So, so can we move on to your first recommendation of a destination? What is it, and why do you recommend it?
Absolutely. So my first destination is a place called Harvington Hall, which is in Worcestershire. And it's this beautiful 16th century house, really. I think that's when it was mainly built, although it has origins earlier on. And it's moated, it's red brick, and it's set in this beautiful scenery. And I think it's owned by the church. So it's kind of a strange building that it's not part of one of these big heritage organisations. And the people who run it, there's a guy called Phil, who's this real character who has all of these quite ingenious ways of making, putting events on there and things. But anyway, the house is incredible, and its big story is that the people who lived there were Catholics, and during the 16th century they had Catholic priests, and so it is riddled with priest hides and secret spaces where the priests would have hidden, secret spaces where they would hide the instruments used or the objects used during mass, and beautiful wall paintings. It's it's incredible survival of that Tudor era, of that Elizabethan period when there was all this religious turmoil going on. And Phil, the guy who runs the place, he actually did this experiment to raise money where he sat in the priest hide for, I think, a few days or something. And I think it really messed him up. Yeah, he found it very difficult. And I've sat in there and I've climbed inside, and I've been in there for a few minutes, and it's horrible. It's a really intense place. But it's places like that they're not only incredibly beautiful, but they really bring to life, sitting in a priest hide in that house really hits home about the kind of extent to which people felt this religious persecution and believed so strongly about these issues in the 16th century. So that's a great example of seeing those, those real problems that people had in the past.
For sure. I mean, there's this Kit Harington film or series on Netflix called The Gunpowder Plot, which is so fascinating because it was the first time that it visually really brought to light, for me, the terror that exists within all those priest holes all over the country.
It's amazing, yeah.
And there's so many of them still intact in the UK that people probably can go and sit in like
I know.
You did.
Well, it's the guy who created them was a guy called Nicholas Owen, who was the famous priest hide guy. Okay. And he was this genius woodworker, and he put loads of these priest hides in place, and they think that lots of them probably they don't know where they are still. They haven't been discovered. Yeah.
So, which is the entire point.
Exactly, yeah.
And of course, in Catholic Mass, there's so much incense that's burnt and all those kind of things. So that's what you're referring to when you said that those kind of things were hidden away as well.
Yeah, that's it. It's all, and all the, they had, even just the kind of the goldware and the silverware, they would, if there was an inspector from the Queen would come over, they would suddenly have to hush, put it all away. And there's floorboards where you can lift it up and you can see where they were hidden everything. So a terrifying time. Really. I
can imagine poor Phil did not come out of that priest hole the same as he went in.
I know. It's never been the same.
Never been the same. So Alice, why did Catholic priests have to hide in the sort of 16th century?
It's a great question. So it's in the years after the Reformation, when the Church of England was established. But of course, many people were still Catholics and still practiced Catholicism. But during the Elizabethan period, Queen Elizabeth is often talked about as having a kind of middle way. So it wasn't as extreme as Mary Tudor, who burnt some Church of England bishops. And it wasn't as extreme as Edward VI's approach, which was pretty hardline Protestant. So the middle way came about during Elizabeth I's time. So it meant that although Catholicism was technically banned, there were exceptions made. Having said that, you weren't allowed to have priests, and they still did. So, it's this very difficult time where they're trying to kind of muddle through the religious reforms that had happened in the early half of the 16th century. So basically, priests, you weren't allowed to have Catholic priests in your houses, but lots of people still did because they believed so strongly in the Catholicism. Their faith was so strong that they were prepared to risk breaking the rules, breaking the law, getting in a hell of a lot of trouble, and still have their Catholic priests in the house. So sometimes there'd be inspectors that would come around from Queen Elizabeth I, and when they suddenly heard the inspector here, they would hurry their priests away, and sometimes the priests would be hidden for days on end, and you'd have the inspector knocking on the door, seeing if there are any hollow bits in the house.
Yeah.
So pretty terrifying stuff. You can actually go and see so many of these in Harvington Hall, and they're all hidden beneath staircases. There's one behind a fake library door.
Wow.
So it's quite an incredible place to visit.
And where is Harvington again?
Harvington Hall is in Worcestershire.
Okay, cool.
In a beautiful Worcestershire countryside.
Amazing. Okay, cool. So Alice, how long do people need to spend at Harvington Hall to really get to see it all?
Well, it's in the countryside, so I think unless you're very local, it's probably going to be a bit of a trip there. So I would say spend all day there. It's beautiful. It's beautiful countryside. Go in the summertime and just enjoy the kind of. I'd say take it slow and make it a lovely day of it. And there's a lovely cafe. There's lots to do there. So especially if you've got little children, it's a really beautiful, magical place to go.
So let's move on now to a little bit more about you and just the present currently. You've just published your first book, Uproar. Well, at the end of last year, you published your first book, Uproar. I know there's another one also in the pipeline, which is so exciting. But just tell us about Uproar and what was the inspiration behind it?
So when I was studying at Edinburgh University, I was studying the 18th century, and it's a very exciting time, French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars. But there are a set of artists and a set of visual prints that are always used to illustrate that period in time. So they are basically what we would know today as cartoons. So very lively images, quite rude images, quite funny images, very colourful. And one of the great artists who created these prints was a man called James Gilray. And his most famous print was one of the plum pudding in danger. So people might know about that print. And it shows Pitt and Napoleon carving up the plum pudding, a representation of the world, a representation of world powers arguing over, something in the middle. They were such amazing artists. They forged so many things which are so formative to being British and Britain as it is today. For example, they created all of these ideas about being British, as well as the myth that Napoleon was short. Napoleon wasn't short. Yeah. So that's a big thing to take away from the book. Anyway, I realised when I was at university that these were really important figures, and yet nobody really knew who they are. The general public didn't know who they are. I didn't know who they were as a student.
You mean the people being the ones in the illustrations?
The ones that were creating the illustrations. So the artists.
Yeah.
And it's a set of artists, a bit like a kind of pre-Raphaelite set of artists. There's this late 18th century set of satirists, and I think they should be as famous as Hogarth or Turner. The name really? James Gilray, I think, is important as that. So anyway, I wrote this book called Uproar, which is to just tell their story, and it's been wonderful. It's been great fun so far.
And are there elements of Georgian Britain that appeal to you specifically, or us in the modern day have specific relevance to our lives today at all?
Well, I think we probably perceive Georgian Britain, or probably 10 years ago, we perceived Georgian Britain often in light of Jane Austen.
Yes.
So thinking about drawing rooms and taking turns around the room,
yes.
and quite very, very polite, a lot of manners. And I say that, in recent years, maybe it's changed because of Bridgerton. It's a bit more of a lively scene. But I think what we don't probably think about a lot, or what surprised me when I was writing this book, was that the humour that you see in these prints, the liveliness, the kind of jokes that are thrown around.
As well.
It's so silly.
Yeah.
It's ridiculously silly. And so there's all these kind of very lively aspects of society that you see coming through these prints, shining through these prints. And it really brings that period to life. And I often think, imagine if there was a Gilray working in the Tudor era, you could see that era completely differently. Whereas you only obviously see the periods of history through the things that survive. So for the Tudors, people probably first think about a Holbein painting of Henry VIII.
Yes.
That's like the first image that comes to mind. So it's wonderful with the Georgian era that you can see these images of ordinary life and a lot of silliness.
Yeah, I absolutely love the illustrations that you picked out for your book. But for you, that's a really good point, because obviously you're right, like history and our memory of it or our understanding of it is in part so dictated to by the collections that are still in good hands and preservation today. So what is in your mind like the biggest loss of art collection building historically that you can think of?
I think I'm going to slightly cheat in that I'm going to say the Gilray prints that I was writing about. Not that they were lost, but I think the awareness of them as a really important art form. I think that they should be front and center when we talk about late 18th century art, and they're not really ever categorized in the history of art because they're not paintings.
Yes.
And I think that's a great loss. Our general awareness of them as the British public not knowing about prints, not knowing about figures like James Gilray is a real loss, because it's such a good way in to discovering this bit of history. You know, these prints are funny. They were designed on one level for people who can't read, but they're also designed to have lots of in-jokes in. And at the end of the day, they are actually just jokes.
Yes.
So it's a very accessible way to understand the Georgian period.
And also totally different to that of the sort of Jane Austen understanding of the Georgian period. Like it's could not be more different actually when you look at
many of the exactly. And even completely different from the portraits that you see. You know, the portraits you see are filtered. They are photoshopped. You know, you look at a picture of a portrait of King George IV and it's completely photoshopped in that, you know, we know that he was a pretty large guy, and then it's, you know, he's been slimmed down and he's been edited you know, by Reynolds or whoever it is. So it's wonderful to see these prints. You can see a much more realistic and cutting view of people from the past.
Okay, so now I'm dying to hear about your second recommendation of destination. But yeah, that's really cool to hear about your book Uproar. For now, tell us about your second destination.
Okay, my second destination, it's actually in the same era as Harvington Hall. It's the Guild Chapel in Stratford-upon-Avon.
Yeah, wow.
And this is quite an amazing building. Stratford-upon-Avon is an amazing place to visit. You can go and see Shakespeare's birthplace. You can see where he went to school, where he was buried, where his family lived. You know, there's a lot of houses you can see there. So it's an amazing place to go. But I think one of the highlights is the Guild Chapel, which has this amazing display of medieval wall paintings. And it's a strange thing because there's all these other Shakespearean buildings in Stratford, so people don't tend to go there, but I actually think it's the real gem of Stratford-upon-Avon. It's right in the heart of the town. It's right next to the school that Shakespeare went to. And why I found it so fascinating to go was that there were these medieval paintings which were paid for by a man called Loxton, who was a great man of the town. But in the 16th century, so actually the same sort of time as Harvington Hall had the priest holes put in, they whitewashed the images. So they were covering up the images, as were the orders of Queen Elizabeth I at the time, because they were deemed to be too Catholic.
Right.
But it is amazing because John Shakespeare, the father of William Shakespeare, was the man in charge at the time, and he gave the order to make the paintings whitewashed. We don't quite know when the whitewashing happened. The order was given in 1563. Shakespeare was born in 1564, William Shakespeare, that is. So it was some point near the time that Shakespeare was born. So there is a chance that when Shakespeare was, say, 5 years old, he might have seen them do this act of whitewashing these medieval wall paintings and covering them up for good. But of course, they weren't covered up for good because a few hundred years later, they removed the whitewash and you can actually go and see them there today. But it's a beautiful space. It's one of those churches that's just slightly feels like it's off the beaten track. It's a kind of a very peaceful, tranquil space, a retreat from the hustle and bustle outside. So that's a must-see for any cool Stratford-upon-Avon visitors.
Why does that carry personal significance for you?
So I find going to these buildings sometimes so thrilling because you can actually stand there and know that people from the past actually stood in that exact same space, which is pretty incredible. And the idea that young William Shakespeare, say a toddler, even imagining him as a toddler is quite strange, but knowing that he was there in that space and he might have stood there with his father giving the instructions to whitewash the walls, it's like the priest-tides. It really brings home that these people did actually live through these events. I know it sounds a strange thing to say, but we talk about these things like stories, the Reformation happened and the gunpowder plotters, and we're so familiar with them, but it's hard sometimes to really think that these were real people. Henry VIII was actually a real person. And I think it's wonderful when you can go to a space and it can really bring that to light. And to see William Shakespeare as well connected to this whole Reformation history, which you don't necessarily associate him with because you always associate him with Queen Elizabeth I and much later in the 16th century. So I just found it incredibly moving to go there, and I'm a big Shakespeare fan, so I would like it's wonderful to see these other kind of historic events happening that must have informed his writing.
How long do people need to spend at the Guild Chapel?
So I think the Guild Chapel is just one room, so there's not a huge amount to see in some ways. There's not a lot of rooms to kind of work through. I would say go to Stratford-upon-Avon for the day. Go to Shakespeare's birthplace, go to King Edward's School where you can see his schoolroom, go to the Guild Chapel and go to Holy Trinity Church. And then if you've got time in the evening, go to the theatre where you can see a Shakespeare play. But I think together, all of those things you could probably see in a day and get a real Shakespeare experience.
Yeah. So that was Alice's second recommendation. Thank you so much, Alice. So now we're going to just go on to discuss, what are some of the projects that you're working on now? I know you are the true definition of a multi-hyphenate. You've got so many things that are going on, but all, as you said, anchored around history and heritage. And I know that you've already written and your soon to be new book. It's called 18, A History of Britain in 18 Young Lives. And it would be so cool to get a little insight into what that's about.
Yes, well, I am very excited. My new book's coming out, which is called 18, and it's published on the 15th of August. So that happens to be A-level results day, quite conveniently.
Oh my gosh.
They bring back bad memories for some people.
Yeah.
But that's very... But it's actually very good timing because the book's all about young people in the past. It's all about being 18 years old, 18, and what the experience was like for different people in the past over the centuries. So to shine a light on what it's like to be an 18-year-old today, I've basically looked at 1,000 years of experiences of 18-year-olds. So Bede is the first one, the Anglo-Saxon monk, and then it goes through people like Chaucer and Elizabeth I. There's unknown people like Jack Francis, who was one of the characters in that book, Black Tudors, and he's this guy who dives down and he retrieves the cannons from the Mary Rose. So it's amazing story. But so there's unknown figures and there's some famous names. There's Brunel, there's Mary Anning, there's Vivian Westwood.
Who is Mary Anning?
So Mary Anning was a girl who was born on the south coast in Lyme Regis in Dorsetshire, and she became incredible at finding fossils in the 18th century. Yeah, so she was amazing at gathering these fossils, but actually she became a massive expert on finding these fossils. So and finding these remains, uncovering these remains from the south coast, so much so that even as a teenager, people would talk about her as an expert in her field, which is pretty incredible because she was this 18. Very poor girl who had managed to make a mark on the world. And London men, great London men from the museums would come down and listen to her telling them about what she knew. So pretty remarkable.
That's really
and they made a film about her, I think.
Yeah,
Kate Winslet.
Yes, I was just thinking, we'll need to find out what the name of that film is, because I was just thinking about that when you were describing her, because it's a really beautiful film actually with Kate Winslet playing her, right?
Yes, I think she does, yes. Yeah, so there's lots of, and then it goes through like the C.S. Lewis, and he's going to the Somme. He goes to the Somme on his 19th birthday. And then the last one is Vivian Westwood. And she's amazing because obviously she goes on to become amazing designer, but in her late teen years, she knows she's very creative and all the signs are there, but she just can't see a reality of working in that world. And she just thinks this is so unrealistic. Like, what am I doing? Get a proper job sort of thing. And so she trains to be a typist. And it's amazing that she kind of gave up on her dream or turned away from her dream at that very young age But then, of course, luckily, she came back to it. Of course, lots of people don't ever come back to it.
No.
So I wanted to include some people who have achieved a lot, who have been through a lot, like Empress Matilda, who'd been in charge of Italy. But then also people who were really unsure about what they wanted to do with their lives, as many people are today.
Yeah. Why did you want to write a book about being 18 through the ages?
Well, I think there's lots of different kind of angles you can look at the past. And we've had lots of books that are looking at women's history. We've had lots of Black history. We've had lots of history from all kinds of different perspectives. And I felt that young people have never really been looked at, especially. I don't know if I've ever read a book where it's like, we're just going to look at an 18-year-old and see what they've been doing, or any other age group. I mean, it'd be interesting to write a book about elderly people plus 70, say, what have they been up to in the past, what their lives been like. I mean, it's just another kind of way to have a cross section through society throughout time, and I think it's very interesting and surprising. 18 is such a strange age. It's supposed to be today the age where you become an adult overnight, which is just obviously not necessarily true. Sometimes people say that, our brains don't develop until much later, and lots of people today are not really doing the adult things like owning a house or getting married until much later. And then, of course, in the past, people were doing things much earlier. So I just wanted to kind of investigate that and shine a light on our own experiences of being 18 today.
It's reflective by the sounds of it. Did you find when you were sort of writing it that it was quite reflective for you as to what you were doing at 18?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because in earlier periods in history, people have been through some really tricky things and had, they become adults
so much sooner.
So much younger, yeah. So Nelson, for example, him and many other young boys aged 12 would go and join the Navy. So that's pretty adult experience at age 12. But later on, people are much more uncertain about what they want to do. There are a lot more options because of the development of history, and there's a lot more women doing a lot more interesting things, following their interests. So I found, and then of course in the last 100 years, everyone's basically at university and school. So one of the ones is Rosalind Franklin, who's the great scientist who is a real important figure in discovering DNA or understanding DNA. And we often think of her as this great scientist, but actually the diaries and the letters that she sends when she's 18 is her being at uni, being at Cambridge, going skiing. She talks about après-ski. She talks about what she was wearing, her fancy dress. So it's kind of more relatable the more recent they become.
That's so cool. So that's coming out in August, 15th of August.
15th of August.
Okay, cool. And then because I guess, you've traveled around the country so much making this sort of short form content. Why is it important, in your own words, why is it important for heritage to sort of be kept alive and at the forefront of people's minds? I imagine that, your content really does appeal also to your contemporaries and younger. Is that important to you, that it does inspire future generations to sort of be interested and intrigued by our history and heritage?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the big thing about history and the important thing about history is that history repeats itself, and to understand the present, you have to understand the past. And I think we see this a lot this year in 2024 when we're looking at a lot of 80 years since D-Day and 80 years since the Second World War. And obviously all of those discussions about the Second World War are so important for modern politics and understanding Europe today and what's going on and everything. So that's a very good example of that. But I think I'm driven by the fact that I love these historic buildings and I love heritage, and I find them beautiful and moving and inspiring to look at Salisbury Cathedral and think, how on earth did people build that all those years ago? And I know that I feel that, and I feel an emotional reaction, and I'm engaged by it in that way. But then what's so wonderful is that, while I've been making all this content, there are millions of people who also feel that. So I think there are a lot of people out there who also feel that. And it's wonderful to be able to share those things with these people. I think also lots of people, the most common comment that I get is, I hated history at school, but I love learning about this weird church or this weird quirk that you're showing me. And that's very interesting. So I think...
What does that say to you about...
Well, I suppose it says that people aren't engaged by history at school. Perhaps they see it as a school subject. I mean, if you think about all the history that exists, it's very narrow what is taught at school. Obviously, they have to teach something, but whatever they choose, it's like only one tiny slither of what you could possibly ever teach in terms of history. But I think what I see is that everyone's interested in history. everyone definitely is, because it's everything that's ever happened.
Yes.
You just have to help people find their hook, find their way in.
Yes.
And whether that be the history of football or fashion or wallpaper or like military history or food history, whatever it is, people have an interest in it. And if people can get in through TikTok, or they can get in from watching one little section on the Great British Bake Off where they talk about some historic pudding, whatever it is, like, it doesn't really matter. Or if they watch films, even if they're watching Bridgerton, that's not like completely accurate, it's kind of, bending the truth a bit, but it's still inspiring this aesthetic of a beautiful Georgian house, and that is something that is real. So I just hope that I can help people understand and enjoy these places, and when you do, you suddenly see this wonderful history everywhere, and it's like, you can walk along you can have your commute every day, and you can walk along the same street every single day, and you can either just do that walk, or if your eyes are open to these amazing buildings which are everywhere, and we're so lucky in the UK to have all these buildings everywhere, suddenly it's enriching, it's exciting, it's beautiful,
and I think it makes you so present when you're when you're sort of actually looking up rather than looking down at your phone, which we're all guilty of doing. But I don't think there's anything, once you start being able to sort of pick out features that probably mostly you, Alice, have like taught you about, these little kind of architectural features that are just dotted around cities like London, or indeed Edinburgh's got similar. It makes you so present. It makes you so conscious of where your feet are, and actually the fact that you're kind of you're walking down whatever street it might be. Don't you think?
No, absolutely. It's amazing suddenly when we realize what's around, and it is true. I know it's a cliche, but it is true that every single street has something fascinating to say. Every single building, I'd be confident you can make a TikTok that people would find really interesting, or find some snippet that would be really interesting, because even if seems like a very bog standard building, just explaining, the brickwork of that building. Everything has a reason. Everything's got a really weird, strange reason.
because they all used to think about it at such great length and depth. I mean, they spent 25 plus years. We just, Blenheim took 30 years to be built, and you can imagine people for 30 years are sort of thinking about the intricate details, outside, external, internal. With that in mind, every detail that you ever see on a street or indeed a building, there's been someone in the past that's given that great thought. So
there's such strange reasons why they've happened. I mean, probably the most popular thing, reliably, the most popular content that I post about it's basically telling a story about something that people are completely familiar with. So a bollard, a window, brickwork, those ones go viral. They always go viral. And it's because people see it every day, and then they're like, wow, that's amazing. And then you can see it everywhere.
Because then you actually know where it comes from.
Yeah. So like bollards, originally they are shaped like that in London because they used to have these cannons from the Napoleonic Wars that couldn't be retrofitted into British ships. They were French cannons, and then they'd send them back to London and they'd put them out as bollards. It's a kind of trophy of war. And then there'd be a cannonball put in the top, so they'd be upturned bollards, and then they'd have a cannonball at the end at the top, so it's got that rounded top.
Yes,
and there are
iconic.
So there are some still around, and they did do this all around Europe. It's not just the UK, but then they developed this shape, and you can still see the shape today. And now everywhere you look, you're like, oh look, that's so cool, that bit of the street.
That heralds from the Napoleonic Wars.
It's quite fun.
That's really cool. We're coming to the end of the show now, and I would just love to know what your final recommendation is that you have for us today.
My final recommendation is another church, I'm afraid, but I think it is a really good example, a fascinating example of how these buildings change through time and how many chapters buildings go through. So my final recommendation is Temple Church, which is this kind of hidden gem right in the heart of London. It's in the Temple area, so it's where there's a lot of lawyers around there. Basically, it's like lawyer central. And it's this church which was once the HQ of the Knights Templar. So it's if you like your Dan Brown sort of thing, it's big kind of.
Because what was the Knights Templar? Just explain.
So it was the HQ of the Knights Templar, which was this group of crusading knights in the early medieval period. So if you think about like the Crusades, it's those guys, and they had Temple Church as their HQ, and so it's very, very old. It's got these amazing effigies inside, and then over the years there's been amazing events happening there. So when Magna Carta was signed, lots of the meetings beforehand were happening there. So it's a really important place for law, and all the law courts grew up around it as well. Over the years, it was used as a church and developed in all these different ways. But in the Second World War, it was completely blitzed. It was completely bombed out, and you could see through to the sky. It was almost gone in some ways, but they've rebuilt it completely, and now you can go and you can see it, and it's as it was. And I suppose it's an interesting question, that, because is it the same church or is it a new church?
What's your view of that?
I think it depends how much of it is rebuilt.
Yeah,
but it was the roof, and it was certain sections, and I think there was a lot of it was still there, really, but they did have to basically rebuild the roof, and I think it definitely is the same building, because when you actually look at his history and you look at, say, cathedrals, they are always extending, they're adding in wings, there's fires, they're building a new tower, there's a spire that falls down. Like, it's always changing and chopping and changing all the time. So
the foundations are still there. The foundations are still the same.
The foundations are the same, yeah.
That's what I think about it being.
Do you? Yeah. And it's been a place of worship non-stop. It's been continually used in the same way for all these years. It's a beautiful space. It's got amazing music. It's got an incredible choir. The organ, the Glentanner organ, is famous in itself. It came from a Scottish ballroom. Basically, I think Lord Glentanner, he had this massive organ created, and then he realised it didn't really work in his ballroom in Scotland, so they shipped it down after the Blitz. I think after they needed a new organ, they shipped it down. So and apparently when the Queen visited Temple Church later on, and she came there, and she heard the sound of the organ, and she could remember it from her childhood, because they used to dance in the ballroom in Scotland to that organ. So yeah, that's quite a sweet story. But it's a wonderful church. It's a very active church, and it's got beautiful music. But I think for me, it's an amazing. It's what's so brilliant about London and about lots of British history, in that it encompasses so much history in one go. You can go there and be in the space where the Knights Templar were discussing affairs, discussing their next crusade. You can go in a space where a medieval guy is supposed to have been left to die on his own. You can go in a space where there was also kind of the worst moments of the Blitz, and all of this history is in one location.
Very cool.
Yeah, and they did some funny things, actually, like when the original building, I think the columns were slanted inwards or something by some mistake.
That doesn't sound like great architecture.
Yeah.
Great architecture.
But when they rebuilt it, they kept that in. So
really?
To keep it as
a feature, as before.
A quirky feature,
funny.
Yeah.
I love that. How long would you recommend people spend in Temple Church to really soak it all up?
So there's a lot to see there in some ways. There's a lot of history about Magna Carta, about the Knights Templar. They've got a lot of boards out in a kind of museum-y way. So you could actually go and read all of those, and that probably take you quite a while. But I think the best way to see it, if you're a visitor or a Londoner, is to go to a service, and then you can see the church in action. You can hear the choir, and also they're very friendly there, so you could talk to the people who work there. But it's somewhere that I think it's good if you're a Londoner to just have it on your radar, because you can always pop in for a service or a concert. They've got lots of lunchtime concerts, so that's a really nice thing.
And also, one of our previous guests is a guy called Dr. Guy Hayward, who's the founder of something called Evensong.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of these churches, Pilgrimage Trust as well.
Of course.
But he now is actively kind of encouraging people to go to Evensong, which happens at about 5 o'clock at every church and cathedral in the country. And I just didn't know anything about that, but I'm actually going to look and see if that happens at Temple Church, because it sounds like an amazing place to enjoy.
Yeah, good idea. No, Evensong, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I think lots of people find that these spaces, whether it be a church or a historic house, they are just so moving and still, and they are just a kind of escape. Maybe it's an escapism thing, and whether that be that you just go and sit in a church and listen to some beautiful choral music for half an hour, that's an amazing break from your busy day and busy life.
Oh, well, Alice, thank you so much for your time. I know how busy you are, and I'm just forever inspired by you and everything that you've got going on, and also the amazing way in which you manage to engage your 1.5 million people with history in such a kind of contemporary way that you're educating us all, frankly, and you do it with such effortless kind of grace. So I'm just so grateful to have you on the show. So thank you so much. Your book is already out, Uproar, so everyone needs to go and get a copy of that. And then you've got 18 History of Britain in 18 Young Lives coming out on the 15th of August. Just tell us about where our listeners can find you.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, thank you so much for having me as well. It's very nice to hear all these such kind words. It's wonderful to be on the podcast as well. So yeah, if you want to follow, you can follow me on all the main platforms: Instagram, TikTok, X or Twitter as it used to be, Threads, and the username is history_Alice. So History Alice, but whatever way you want to follow it, it's fine.
Oh, thank you, Alice. And I know you've got a really busy day, so thank you so much for
Thanks
coming
for having me.
and
It's
being
been
on the show.
wonderful.
Cool, thank you.